work out a little later on, we can maybe figure out a way to make this work. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Alex Duff, and I'm joining you from the University of North Texas. Our speaker today is Professor Susan Schell. I think this is one of those occasions where you might say that the speaker hardly needs any introduction to this group, but she's really one of the most extraordinary scholars of my acquaintance, and it's been an honor to know her over the years that I have. So I just want to very briefly mention a few of her publications and her areas of research before turning things over to her. Susan Schell is the author of Kant and the Limits of Autonomy, Harvard University Press, 2009, The Embodiment of Reason, Kant on Spirit, Generation, and Community, The Rights of Reason. She's also the co-editor of several books and the author of numerous scholarly publications on Kant, German idealism, and selected areas of public policy. She's truly a world-class scholar. We're honored to have her as part of our forum this afternoon. And I'm particularly glad that we could host her here at UNT in this ethereal space. Thank you all for attending. In a moment, I'll turn things over to Susan to introduce her paper, Kant and the Claims of Beauty. But just to prefigure our event this afternoon, she's going to take a few minutes to set up her argument. Sometimes Kant takes a few more steps than normal just to get your mind around it, and then present a version of her paper or some remarks to introduce it. I will, when it's time to take questions, I will keep a queue. So put up your disembodied hand or say something in the chat, and I'll try to keep a queue of it. And then I'll introduce the questioners as we go, and Susan, you can reply, and the discussion should take off from there. So without any further ado, Susan, please walk us through your paper. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a most generous introduction. I'm really grateful for the opportunity, particularly because I'm in one of those odd spaces when, I've submitted a manuscript, but I haven't gotten the reader's reports back yet. It's a little bit like when, as an undergraduate, you turn in the blue book and you don't know what you've done, but you can assume the best before, if you haven't gotten the red markings. So it's a time when what you say, I can change things. So it's great to have such a distinguished and varied audience. As Alex remarked, Kant is particularly the critique of judgment is not on everybody's short list in political theory. And so I feel that I can't presuppose, even though it's a very very important book, but at the same time it's both a very difficult book and one that's, I think, rarely read by political theorists, or at least read in any detail. So I'm going to take the liberty of presenting the argument somewhat sketchily, in hopes that helps those of you, especially for whom the critique of judgment and the critique of taste in particular is sort of new. So let me begin with two primary, if paradoxical, characteristics of beauty and judgments of taste. And for Kant, the two are sort of equivalent. A judgment of taste is a judgment about beauty. First, beauty is subjective, meaning that it's the expression of a feeling, not an objective assertion about the world whose truth could be demonstrated to others. No one can prove to me that something is beautiful if it fails to give me pleasure, and pleasure of a certain kind, just as no one can prove to me that I'm in pain if I don't feel pain. But, and this is the second characteristic, beauty is also universal. That is, the pleasure involved in beauty is peculiar in laying claim to the necessary assent of others. And this decisively distinguishes pleasure, according to Kant, pleasure in the beautiful, from other subjective satisfactions. For example, one's pleasure in a certain wine or spicy food, in which, as he puts it, one is content to let others go their way. At the same time, aesthetic pleasure also differs from the satisfaction to which moral self-legislation gives rise, which is based on an act of pure practical reason, according to Kant. And this aesthetic judgment occupies this curious, autonomous, in-between sphere, and is reducible neither to feeling as a mere sensation, as empiricists like Hutchinson and Burke maintained, nor to a confused version of a rational concept of the good, as rationalists like Mendelssohn and Baumgarten, and maybe on some readings, Plato, seem to claim. And I think ultimately this approach to beauty has a kind of fundamentally Rousseauian provenance, which is very interesting and would be an interesting topic for discussion in its own right. But I think it comes out of basically Kant's reading of and appropriation of Rousseau. Now, Kant asks, how is this combination possible? How can something be subjective, unprovable, a feeling on the one hand, and also make a justified claim to the agreement of others? And Kant's answer, in a nutshell, is that because the pleasure in question is not merely a placid or receptive experience, an expression of our sensible makeup that varies with the individual, like an aversion to coffee or spicy food, but rather the expression of an active mutual animation of cognitive faculties that are peculiarly human. That is, the productive imagination, understanding, and reason. And thus, that beauty is, or our experience of beauty is a feeling, as he puts it, of mental life. And therefore, it's something that we can attribute, at least in the simple sense, to others as well. I'll get to that in a moment. So the primary example of beauty would be simple natural beauties, shells, flowers, and so on, a taste for which is, as it were, constitutive, because it is in a way bound up with what undergirds all of our experience, because it involves, he says, a harmony of imagination and understanding that is also necessary for ordinary empirical knowledge and can therefore justifiably be expected of everyone. The difference between judgments of taste and empirical cognition, or one important difference at least, is that in the former case, imagination harmonizes freely with the laws of understanding rather than under the compulsion of conforming with conceptual rules, as is the case in empirical judgments. That is, you don't need to know that something is a rose or even that it's a flower to find it beautiful. So it's not dependent, it seems, on a concept of the kind of thing the object in question is. Now, this leads me to my second point, which is that this gives rise to a basic political and moral problem. Because although we can experience beauty, let's say the beauty of a rose in isolation, our pleasure in it is intrinsically social. That is to say, in recognizing it as beautiful, in some at least provisional, preliminary level, we kind of expect others to agree with us. And this leads us not only to contemplate roses' beauty for its own sake, but say to wear it or decorate our homes in order to please and win the approval of others. And indeed, when civilization reaches its highest stage, Kant claims, the pleasures of taste readily allow themselves to be melted down together with the baser inclinations of vanity and luxury, as Rousseau so brilliantly argued in the first discourse and elsewhere. And indeed, I think that with the critique of judgment, or the critique of taste, is a response to that critique on Rousseau's part. That is to say, at this highest stage of civilization, or near the highest stage, beauty becomes a kind of currency, valued less for its own sake than for what one can obtain with it. As Kant famously puts it in the Idea for Universal History, which probably we've all read, we are highly cultured, we are civilized almost to excess, but as for our being moralized, much is lacking. And yet, as he adds, if we cannot work our way out of this condition, history would amount to nothing more than semblance and glittering misery. So now my third point, what is then Kant's aesthetic solution to this problem, the civilizational problem an historical problem in the critique of judgment. And let me just sort of run through a number of points. First, I think Kant's response consists in a clarification of the criteria of beauty as such, and then a justification of its primary claims with respect to natural beauty. And this occupies the first part of the critique of taste. Namely, a principle that is constitutive, as he puts it, for human cognition as such. But then second, to identify and justify a principle of taste that is suitable for artful beauty, which is not original and natural, like a taste for natural beauty, but must be acquired, and for that very reason, particularly problematic, both conceptually and socially. In other words, we're not born loving Homer. We have to learn Greek, or we have to know something about history, and so on. Whereas everybody, in a sense, is born, finding roses beautiful. So here, first, the conceptual problem that is posed by fine or beautiful art. And in German, schöne Kunst means both fine art and beautiful art. So speaking conceptually, how can something be recognized as a work of art, which presupposes a purpose or intention, and hence a concept of some sort on the part of the artist, and still be judged beautiful? That is, involve freedom of imagination from conceptual determination. And Kant's answer to this question, again, briefly put, is artful beauty, a work of art to be judged beautiful must also be judged to be a work of genius. That's the only way you can solve this particular problem. So what does he mean by a genius? So this is a third point. The imagination of the artist who is endowed with genius and the judge equipped to recognize artistic genius does not just freely conform with the laws of understanding as in judgments of simple natural beauty, but goes beyond them. The productive imagination goes beyond what it enacts in the judgment of natural beauty, creating, as it were, Kant says, another nature. And hence it can incorporate concepts while also remaining free. And Kant calls such creative products of the imagination aesthetic ideas. Such ideas exceed what can be empirically cognized, though they do so intuitively rather than conceptually, as with ideas of reason. And they thereby, Kant claims, involve not only the kind of mutual animation of understanding and imagination, but they also bring reason into motion. And I'll turn at the end, I think, to an example of this, which involves the use of the images of Jupiter and his eagle and Juno and her peacock to express and thereby communicate to others an aesthetic idea that centralizes, as Kant puts it, the rational idea of creation. So fourth small point, in thus animating all the forces of the mind, including reason, artistic beauty of the proper exemplary sort, that's not just nice, that's just nice and pretty, but that counts as a work of genius, not only strengthens the forces of the mind, as Kant puts it, but also, quote, contributes to the ongoing progress of culture in ways that our simple pleasure in natural beauty does not. And it is this, in this sense, you could say superior to natural beauty. But artful beauty also has two downsides. First, artful beauty that doesn't rise to the level of genius, that lacks spirit, as Kant puts it, and does not bring reason into motion, soon becomes repellent. It bores us and eventually it disgusts us. Pictures of clowns that you've seen a million times, they might have been sort of pretty nice the first time, but they pall after a while if they don't genuinely involve this activation of reason. And you could say Picasso's paintings of clowns, yes, your standard hotel picture, hotel room picture of a clown, probably not. And second, its artful beauty is problematic because a taste for fine art, as I mentioned, has to be acquired rather than being original and natural. And therefore, its judgments are controversial, not only conceptually, for how can reproof of those lacking in taste be justified, but also politically and socially, pitting the more and less refined, or those who consider themselves more refined but don't necessarily have good taste, but at least think they do, against one another. So Kant's critical resolution of what he calls the resulting antinomy of taste, his reconciliation of the subjectivity of artful beauty, a taste for artful beauty and its demand for universal agreement, permits, and this is where the solution comes about, mutual communication between the more and less refined. It allows it to move forward productively rather than, resulting to this kind of impasse and antagonism. With the former, that is to say, the subjective side contributing, with the former, that is the more refined, contributing the discipline that makes taste enduring, and the latter, the sort of popular originality, the natural, genius and freedom without which taste grows stale. That is to say, I think Kant, in a way, originates the idea of class conflict. I mean, he has a technical understanding of conflict, Streiten, which is a kind of disagreement that can move forward productively because it presupposes hope and eventual agreement, as opposed to mere opposition. So it's not like, I guess, in a certain sense, it's like Marxist class conflict, but it's friendly, unlike Marxist conflict. It's not open warfare. The big point then is this: culture, as Kant newly conceives it in the Critique of Judgment, internalizes and transforms the principle of asocial sociability that had characterized his earlier account of history and what is enlightenment and the idea for universal history. Culture, as Kant now defines it, newly defines it, has two senses, one positive and one negative. Culture in a positive sense, or what he calls the culture of skill, gives rise to the necessary elements of culture, namely science and art. But it also presupposes a social inequality that relegates the greatest number, he says, to quote, lives of oppression, bitter toil, and little enjoyment. At this stage, quote, the tendency to the dispensable destroys the indispensable, and progress gives way to luxury or desires that are both unstable and potentially insatiable. At such a critical moment, quote, the plague on both sides becomes equally mighty, on the one hand through outer violence, on the other through inner insufficiency, unquote. And yet this glittering misery, as he puts it, is, quote, bound up with the natural predispositions of the human species, and thus promotes nature's end, if not our own, namely the establishment of that civil society in which reciprocally conflicting freedom is opposed by lawful power. Now, thus far, Kant has hardly gone on the account of asocial sociability and the idea for universal history. But he now supplements that account in the Critique of Judgment, though I think this is rarely noted, with what he calls a negative culture of discipline. And he gives discipline a very different definition than he had given it in the Critique of Pure Reason, and hence a second pathway to moral ends, not mentioned in the idea for universal history. Now, inclination is disciplined aesthetically in two complementary ways on this account. First, by reinforcing a taste for natural beauty, which is original and natural, but also easily corrupted. And second, by encouraging, thanks to Kant's own critique of taste, a kind of productive class conflict over taste, so that everyone moves toward an ever greater appreciation of works of genuine genius. In sum, Kant aims to raise the art of reciprocal communication between the more and less refined to a higher level of critical self-awareness than was possible in ancient Greece and Rome, whose discovery of the art of mutual communication between the more and less refined was the prelude, the necessary prelude to their imperfect, but nevertheless inspiring a solution to the political problem. The glittering misery to which class inequality has heretofore given rise can now be offset, perhaps one day canceled entirely, through a mutual humanitate, that is, as he puts it, the universal feeling of participation and the capacity to communicate one's inmost self that constitute the sociability that is not only natural to us as empirical species, but also appropriate to our Menschheit, to our humanity in this more elevated sense. A universal communication that extends in Kant's final works, not only between classes that constitute a people, an individual people, but also to certain ethnic groups within it. For example, Prussians and Lithuanians. He seems to regard their mutual communication as somehow productive of a kind of healthy civic culture going forward. Kant's confidence in the even partial adequacy of an aesthetic solution to central difficulties of modern political life would soon wane in the face of heightened theological political challenges that he almost immediately faced following on publication of the Critique of Judgment in 1790. But others would take up Kant's hint as to the possibilities of an aesthetic education of humanity. Thus inspired, they would go on to call for and create new nationally based literary and artistic works drawing on the spirit of the people as partially mediated by their more educated interpreters and champions. Grimm's fairy tales might be one example. Individual genius, so understood, channels even as it renders universally communicable the genius of a nation. Now, I think most contemporary artists and critics have largely abandoned the quasi-Kantian hopes that fueled the efforts of Americans like Emerson, Church, Melville, and others to create a specifically American aesthetic canon. Although jazz may represent a particularly instructive, if qualified, late example of what Kant might have had in mind, as Nick Anderson has suggested in a recent essay, very interesting essay. Instead, we find ourselves mired in class conflict of a different sort, a mutually destructive struggle among lifestyles and identities that seems to threaten the very possibility of common citizenship. Can or should reciprocal communication in a Kantian sense be attempted or restored? The question can't be adequately answered, as it seems to me, without a better understanding, pace influential critics such as Clement Greenberg and Arthur Danto of its intended meaning. And now, if with your permission, I'd like to close with a few slides to sort of illustrate what Kant might have had in mind by an aesthetic idea, which is very, very hard to get your, kind of hands on. So let me share your screen.
This is raising the level of our discussions beyond anything we've previously attained.
Because I'm sharing a screen.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the quotation from the, can everybody see this? Is this visible? Say yes.
It certainly is to me, yes.
Okay. So this is a quotation from the Critique of Judgment. It's the one place where Kant, bless his heart, gives an example of what he means, in situ, a concrete example. And it's, it's perplexing. And some people have thought, famously, Sanford Burdick has argued that this is a kind of allusion to Milton, in whom Kant took a great interest, as many Germans in the period did, although he never mentions Milton in the Critique of Judgment. So I'll just read it. Thus, Jupiter's eagle with the lightning in its claws is an attribute of the powerful king of heaven, as is the peacock of the splendid queen of heaven. They do not, like logical attributes, represent what lies in our concept of the sublimity and majesty of creation, but something else which gives imagination cause to spread itself over a multitude of related representations, which let one think more than can be expressed in a concept determined by words. And they yield an aesthetic idea which serves that rational idea instead of logical representation, but really only in order to animate the mind in a way that brings reason into motion. Okay, so here are some illustrations that might help. So let me get rid of this. Oh, whoops, now I'm going to share again. Okay, so this is, So I hope that's visible. Yes, okay. So this is just a picture of that Kant might have seen. Now, obviously, Kant could not go to the Met or the British Museum or the Louvre. He was pretty limited in the kind of visual art he was exposed to. He used to go to dinner in a few aristocratic households, and who knows what kind of art they had on their walls. But he certainly was able to see etchings. And so I'm going to show you two etchings that he might very well have seen, because I think they circulated in Germany at the time. And this is a picture of, well, it's the elements. It's from a book on the elements. This is fire, but it shows a pretty impressive Jupiter and his eagle with the lightning bolts that might convey something of, what. So the idea here seems to be that it sets up a series of associations in one's mind that cannot be encompassed in a determinate concept, but that just sort of animate one's soul in a certain sense. Now, you may not find this a work of genius. I have no reason to think that Kant had this particular work in mind, but at least I think it shows the imagery that he might have been referring to. And then here's another illustration that may be more to the point, because here we see both Jupiter and Juno. Juno's with her peacock and Jupiter with his eagle. And again, this is from a book of etchings this was a scene from an opera that was shown in Vienna. Again, it was printed in Germany, and so Kant might well have seen it. But again, it suggests the kind of imagery that Kant could conceivably have had in mind. And just to make it applicable beyond the period art that he would have probably had in his own experience, just a couple of other examples. So this is James Tissot, late 19th century. It's called Creation. And again, if it sets up in your mind a series of associations that kind of radiate outward and around, and the concept of creation in either a natural or a religious sense, if it works, if it's a work of genius, then it inspires in you a certain kind of pleasure, which expresses a kind of inner animation of your mental faculties, including reason itself. And then a final contemporary example, this is an Aboriginal, all of these being illustrations of creation. Finally, the fourth example, this is an Australian Aboriginal artist, again called Creation. And if it works, and it's very large, so if it's, if a human being were standing here, it would be, the person would come up to about here. So I think sort of seen in the flesh, it's rather impressive. But so again, I think Kant might be led to recognize this, if it indeed passes muster as a work of genius, as satisfying the criteria that he joined. So it doesn't necessarily have to be representational in a simple sense in order to inspire an aesthetic or convey an aesthetic idea. On the other hand, I don't think for him artistic beauty is the purely formal abstraction that someone like Clement Greenberg, who sort of famously, claimed to be a Kantian, I don't think Clement Greenberg quite got it. At least whatever there is to be said for his theory of art, it wasn't strictly Kantian. So I will stop this now, and that's it. Turn it over to you all, and look forward to your comments, questions, and objections.
Well, that's tremendous. Thanks, Susan. I'll keep a queue of questions. Anyone who has a thought percolating, feel free to put up the yellow hand thing, or else add your name to the chat if that doesn't quite work. Perhaps I could begin with, I see Michael's asking. Professor Gillespie, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, Susan, I'm very interesting. I'm wondering about sort of post-Kantians and the rejection of this, and particularly a return to primitivism. You know, you see this in Picasso's interest in African masks. You see it in Klay's work. You see it in all kinds of work, and that seems to aim at speaking to a much broader audience by appealing to something that is more basic in all human beings. And I'm wondering if you think that Kant was going off in a different direction, or he would see that as a rejection of reason as a motivating force in human life, or if you've given that any thought.
Well, I mean, I think actually that, I mean, on my reading, perhaps perverse, it's actually very much a translation of what Kant had in mind. He thinks about, you know, a kind of folk spirit that is original and natural. And I mean, insofar as genius is randomly distributed, it exists in all peoples everywhere. And but the difficulty is that there's a sort of dialectic in a non-Kantian sense, I think here, that on the one hand there's a kind of originality and that expresses not simply the raw kind of cognitive faculties that we all share, but that may express a kind of genius which is not only individual but also peculiar to a people. I mean, he did have this this perhaps in some ways disturbing view, but in other ways perhaps you know, kind of inspiring view that different peoples, for whatever reason, have different insights, and that collectively, you know, we do together what we can't do simply on our own. So it's a little bit like, you know, that I mean, primitive art, you don't just sort of go and look at it in the jungle, right? I mean, you look at it at the Met or the Museum of Fine Art, because what you need is someone who has a kind of refinement of taste that can see in the primitive work what perhaps the primitive person can't see directly, but it's so that all our aesthetic culture becomes a kind of combination of what is primitive or original and natural, or, you know, freedom in its primal form. It's like, you know, childlike, if you will, but is also very easily corrupted. It needs to be appreciated. It needs to be nurtured by those who have a more cultivated sense of taste. But this can only happen if the more and the less refined, if the crude, if the primitive, and the so-called elite enter into a kind of mutually respectful conversation with each other. And the difficulty is that rarely happens, you know. And Kant is thinking less about primitive peoples than primitive Germans. You know, I mean, peasants. Writing at a time.
But
yeah.
I was just going to say the Rites of Spring, the premiere of the Rites of Spring, which left all of the, let's say, academicians, the educated elite, angry with Stravinsky for that, and yet it was meant to provoke primitive passions and just not just to display them, but to
well, that may be what Stravinsky intended, but I think Kant perhaps, and maybe others who appreciate Stravinsky, might say, no, actually, it's you know, I mean, the so-called refined standard easily becomes ossified and somewhat trite and conventional and academic, and therefore it needs the constant infusion of genuine genius, which probably will not be immediately recognized by conventional taste. And so I think in a way Kant is anticipating, I think what's now a kind of well-worn idea that, you know, that in a way the job of the critic is not to simply, you know, kind of repeat the past, but to recognize innovation I mean, not exclusively as we now think about it, but you know, in popular culture or from popular sources. That's a not uncommon trope in contemporary aesthetic understanding and museum, curatorship and so on. That one is constantly on the lookout for, there was that wonderful exhibit of quilts made by African-American women, who were not intending to be fine artists when they made those quilts, but they had a sense, they had an aesthetic sense. They communicate something profound that needed interpretation to be brought out and made available, to be communicable to a broader audience. So I think in a way Kant foresees that movement, and so much of 19th century artistic production sort of presents itself as a kind of channeling of popular folkish motifs. I don't think that the primitive is necessarily, the attachment to the primitive in the 20th century is necessarily so different. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory response, but I mean, I may be straining a little bit to give Kant more credit, but I think it really does prefigure a lot of the actual history of artistic appreciation in the 19th and 20th century, for better and for worse.
Professor Church, go ahead.
Thanks, Susan. Enjoyed reading what you sent along and listening to your talk here. I particularly liked, the way in which you, made central, as it were, the figure of the genius in Kant's critique of judgment, because this is often in the readings of the third critique, you get, sort of the emphasis on the very early bits, the sort of often read in a kind of formalist way that you suggest. So I was glad to see that. And excuse me, I think my questions had to do with the figure of the genius in Kant. First of all, I guess I'm curious, to sort of connect with the Rousseau context, if you thought that Kant had in mind something like Rousseau's legislator as playing a sort of functionally similar role as the genius, that is, a figure who sort of comes around and reorders society, and that's in fact what makes the legislator count as a legislator, is because it's sort of received by molds the people as a people. I ask that because secondly, this is again, I follow Michael Gillespie. This is sort of when you get into the 19th century, these sorts of ideas become more familiar. I'm thinking especially Nietzsche, where you have this idea of, Nietzsche in his early period uses the very term from Kant's third critique of the exemplar, a figure of an exemplar who sort of legislates for the culture of the people. I guess even though I myself tend to find a lot of similarities between Kant and Nietzsche, there's certainly a lot of differences too. And I wonder in particular, sort of maybe you could say a little bit more about kind of the basis for Kant, what seems to be a rather optimistic expectation that something like the figure of the genius can play this reconciliatory role ultimately in history, to sort of bring together the different classes and unify faculties and whatnot. It seems to me, in someone like Nietzsche's view, there's much more of a conflictual, with no ultimate resolution in mind.
Yeah, thank you. Those really are rich questions. So let me try to address at least some of them. So I think in the paper, the summary paper, I left out a big hunk of the book. The hunk of the book that I left out, just because it was already long enough, is Kant's treatment of rhetoric, which is, according to Kant, poetry is the highest form of art, and rhetoric is the sort of evil twin of poetry. And he does a really beautiful inversion, I think, of something that Chris Kelly has written about, which is in Rousseau, the legislator persuades because he can't. Conviction is out of the question, because if you're simply in service to reason, then you're going to be self-interested. And so in order to create a civic culture, you have to persuade, you have to appeal to emotion, imagination, not reason. And Kant reverses that and says, no, 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 ultimately you have to convince, the legislator has to convince, not persuade. That is to say, ultimately, unlike for Rousseau, for Kant, the appeal has to be to reason. And anything else, therefore, is a kind of manipulation, which enslaves the mind rather than freeing it. And so, although in some ways Kant is very close to Rousseau, in this respect, he's flagrantly opposed, because for Kant, reason means something different, finally, than it means for Rousseau. For Rousseau, reason is always ultimately in the service of the self, it seems, and for Kant, of course, it's the moral law. This great product is the moral law, which is something quite different. So in that sense, I think their thought goes in different directions. But insofar as beauty, the productive imagination, that what Rousseau teaches Kant, I think, is that the productive the capacities of the productive imagination, and it's in partnership with reason, especially in a work like Emile that Kant took so seriously and so much to heart, as an expression of what Rousseau calls, well, it's really the feeling of one's own existence, or the feeling of life, one's own life. I mean, that way of framing beauty as an experience, I think is the essential thing that, among many other things, but the essential thing that Kant picks up from Rousseau. So I'm not sure I've, as for Kant,
you don't, I guess you don't see a kind of legislative role for Kant's genius then.
No, and in
right?
fact, the other thing I would want to say is that he says the genius, I mean, there's raw genius. Raw genius, you need both. You need genius and the discipline of taste. That is to say, raw genius is just idiosyncratic nonsense. It needs to be refined. It needs to go to school. It needs to study classical examples or have some other kind of education. So he's not simply a kind of exponent of genius there's this odd combination within the genius to create art that is communicable. I mean, a genius could have great ideas and feelings, and it would be marvelous, but he has to learn how to put those ideas in a communicable form, and for that he needs this kind of refined education. So he needs both. And by the way, unfortunately, it probably is he for Kant. But nevertheless, genius itself, raw genius, is insufficient. And I think I think it's not completely articulated, but I think there's a parallel. There's a comparison between what goes on within the individual genius, what is simply innate natural talent, and what has to be cultivated through his sort of more civilized education, and these two aspects are necessary to put together for genuine human development, which is our innate love of freedom, which we're born with, and then its regularization. It's being made lawful. And in a way, history is either the successful or the unsuccessful attempt to reconcile freedom and law. And so you could say that back and forth, which the outcome of which is not, I think, for Kant necessarily preordained. I mean, I think there's a pessimistic as well as an optimistic side to Kant, although I think he's often read as simply an optimist. In other words, we could fail. I mean, humanity really could totally fail. He makes that clear in works like Perpetual Peace, that it could all blow up. It's really up to us whether it succeeds or not.
Professor Larrivee, go ahead.
Hi there. I just saw the next slide, and I thought you might give an analysis of the fountain.
Oh, you saw the text.
The content, I was
Oh,
waiting for
why
an
was I- what did
analysis
I have
of
in
a
there?
Kantian analysis of the fountain.
Yeah,
If you wouldn't
no,
mind.
I mean, this is way above my pay grade. I mean, I'm not an art critic, and I love to go to museums and gape at art, but I've never made a professional study of it. Well, I mean, on the one hand, the fountain was Arthur Danto loved. This was the so-called the work that Arthur Danto would so often cite to refute Clement Greenberg. That, in other words, that art is conceptual, and it's very much involved with a kind of aesthetic world or culture. It's not simply kind of formal object that we respond to because of our mental faculties being empirically this way or that way. But again, I think you could understand, if you stretched, you could look at the urinal. I mean, if it inspires in you, thoughts that arouse, that stimulate reason itself, because they reverberate, they resonate with a rational idea of, what could it be? I mean, it could be the commodification of our environment. It could be the problematic character of art itself. I mean, there are many ways in which it embodies, or it calls to mind, a kind of a rational concept, which cannot be simply you cannot be represented simply as an empirical object, and in the way that the concept of a cat is instantiated in fluffy. So I think you could conceivably give a kind of Kantian explanation of why Duchamp's urinal is a work of genius. Now, I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying, if you were going to go that way, you would have to make an argument of that kind. But so that's what that was doing. But I wasn't going to show it. So I hope you'll forgive me for not giving the most adequate answer.
Dr. Hawley, go ahead, please.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I really enjoyed the paper, but I have this confusion still. I'm not a Kant expert, but I have had these very frustrating conversations over aesthetics with people. And I kind of am still struggling with understanding how the communicability is supposed to work. And it seems to me that two possibilities come to mind, both from the paper and from what you've said. So one is that the phrase keeps cropping up as the communicability of the feeling, which seems to me to say to try to explain to someone else what you experience when you experience the beauty in a thing. And that might take the form even of saying well, this is beautiful to me because it calls up some nostalgic experience from my past that you can't possibly share because you weren't there when I was a child and saw this the first time. And the other one is more explaining. So, why does, the Roman eagle hold the arrows in its claw? Or you need to know some Greek history in order to appreciate Homer. Is it both of these things? And it seems to me there are problems with either. So communicating the feeling for the reasons I just gave might not in any way get the other person to share it with you. And the explaining seems to me to work better with things like poetry than with things like visual art. That I got something out of that Aboriginal painting, even without having any sort of explanation for it. It would seem to me that someone not of the Western tradition might be able to appreciate the beauty of the Pietà without knowing anything about, Jesus and Mary. So what actually do we communicate with each other when we do this bridging the gap between subjectivity and universality?
So great question. So I struggle over this too, but I think a lot is sort of wrapped up with the English word communicability or communication and the German word Teilnehmung, which really means you could say, you could say that maybe those of you who are native speaker German can correct me here, but I think the German term is really shareability. In other words, it's not communication like I communicated my disease, my COVID, Omicron, here it comes. It means that you too, or like if it means that others can appreciate it too. It does not literally mean you transmit it to them. And therefore the difference, so you could have, there could be a splotch of paint on a canvas and it would make you quiver, you painted it, and any of you have ever tried painting as I have, you think, oh yeah, I can look at that and I sort of shiver inside. But is anybody else going to shiver inside when they look at it? If I'm Picasso, yes. If I'm an amateur painter with little talent, no. And so it's not the job of the critic to make it communicable. It's the exercise of refined genius to be able to take to come up with an image, either visual or verbal or auditory, that resonates around a kind of rational concept of some kind in a way that will appeal to others too. And so Kant gives the example in the case of a genius, of an artist, that even after you've been trained, you have a basic idea, then you sort of, you kind of put it out there, and then you have to keep revising it, and you have this in your mind's eye, some notion of what it needs to be like in order for others to have the same response that you have. And that's something I think closer to what he means by communicability. It's not transmission, it's shareability.
The next question is from Aaron Gamonley.
Hi, Professor Schell. Thank you very much for this. I was going to ask about something somewhat similar, something that I've been thinking about as you guys have been talking, and I can't quite remember how this gets resolved in the third critique, so I'm hoping you can help me. The antinomy seems to be, as you brought up in the beginning, on the one hand, beauty is something of a matter of feeling, that if, I think as you said, I don't feel that this thing is beautiful, nothing can convince me that it is, because beautiful things are not susceptible to being described with determinal, or being subsumed under determinate concepts. On the other hand, we think that the beautiful experience is universal.
Or that others should agree with us, or there's something wrong
Yes.
with them if they don't agree with us.
Precisely, yes, okay, so this is the antinomy that he poses. It seems like there might be, in the discussion of taste and the cultivation of taste, and as maybe we were discussing before with the primitivists, and how this first has to appear in a museum and be, I can't remember the word that you used, not explained, but somehow made manifest to us in order for us to see how it is worthy of being in the museum. It does seem like there is something that is communicated through determinate concepts. And I think we have this experience oftentimes of when we see something beautiful, we want to show that to another person. And it can be shown in some sense that you can help your friend see something that they didn't see, or hear something that they didn't hear, or something that will help them see something that, see that a thing is beautiful when before they maybe didn't. And this has to be the case in order for, the community to be educated in the taste for Homer and this sort of thing. So how is it that Kant resolves this problem that on the one hand, the beautiful things cannot be explained, their beauty can't be explained by concepts, but on the other hand, we do this sort of communication, and that there is something that can be affected by talking about it?
So that's also a great question. So I think when Kant talks about communicability, he's not talking about the mutual education of people who just, I mean, in other words, he thinks it's very important in the case of artful beauty. I mean, no, it doesn't take much to think a rose is beautiful, although there may be peculiar roses that you really have to have a very refined taste to get why they're beautiful. Maybe a decayed rose has a sort of beauty that wouldn't automatically appear unless you had a kind of education in melancholy, other melancholy works of art and so on. But so you learned, you acquire, you refine your taste, you acquire a genuine taste for artful beauty through social encounters and through your own experience of other works of art. So in other words, if you go to a number of museums when you're a kid or when you're a teen, I mean, this is the whole justification of art appreciation courses, right? Is that not that you sort of prove to people, Rembrandt is beautiful. No, it's just that by inviting others to expose themselves to examples of genius, and also, but on the other hand, of being willing to listen to the novice who may have an insight that you don't have, because your refined taste have become conventionalized in certain ways that you're an old fuddy-duddy. You can't appreciate the Impressionists when I mean, now we all think the Impressionists made beautiful art, but of course the Academy didn't. They were so stuck in their ways that they couldn't. They needed to be somehow jostled out of their complacency, and that's I think the kind of mutual conversation that Kant is trying to bring about. I think he may be thinking about his own experience as an upwardly mobile kid who came in contact with aristocratic households, had something unique and original to contribute, but had to learn how to express himself in ways that met the standards of high society. At the same time, that high society alone, without these infusions of original talent, often from the lower classes, pretty soon becomes stale and decadent. So that's, I think, the kind of social interaction that he has in mind. And indeed, it seems to be the ultimate, why do we have museums? Why do we have public museums? Why is there's a sense that it's good for citizenship, for people to see beautiful art at the Met or the Boston Museum of Fine Arts? Where did that idea come from? Rather than closing up these artworks in aristocratic households or, leaving them for royalty. It seems to me that there was a kind of sense that there was a kind of civic education but at the same time that these museums made themselves open to new forms of art. They didn't simply reproduce, plaster versions of classical sculpture. They were alert to what was kind of new and original and I think this idea also became very much part of nation building in the 19th century. So, the civic formation of a culture through this teasing out from primitive, original, popular sources of something more. So I'll give you this example that, I mean, there's a lot of pottery, a lot of primitive pottery out there, but you need a certain refinement of taste to notice which of the various pots is genuinely beautiful, deserves to be in the museum as a work of art. And the person making the people making the pots may not have had the wherewithal, even if they could, the person who made the genuinely beautiful pot kind of knew there was something special, didn't have the means of communicating that in the sense of sharing it, convincing others that it was special. So you need both. You need both sides of the equation. I think that's kind of what Kant has in mind.
The queue as it stands, as I have it right now, is Tim Brennan, Brian Battar, Michael Gillespie, and Nasser Benagar. If there's time, I have a question as well. But if we're getting toward the final half of our conversation. So do add yourself to the queue if you'd like. Tim, go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks, Susan. So my question, I guess it's kind of simple-minded. If Rousseau, and I think it's more connected to your introductory chapter than to this particular paper, although it's also connected to this paper. So if Rousseau says that progress in the arts and sciences tends to make people less happy and or less moral, you could pick either or both of those. What exactly is Kant's response to Rousseau in the Critique of Taste? Is it essentially to do with the possibility of patriotic art of a very exalted kind? I mean, the examples you gave didn't seem to be especially patriotic or nationalistic. So, I mean, I'd just like to clarify that firstly, and then I'm also curious as to how plausible you find that as a response to Rousseau, given the course of history since Kant wrote.
Again, I mean, in a way, I'm pushing it a little bit because I'm suggesting that there's a kind of hint in the Critique of Judgment that is then picked up by later thinkers, Schiller, to begin with. And so, to what degree Kant had this work thoroughly worked out, I wouldn't presume to say. And he does draw back from the relative optimism of the Critique of Judgment, as I mentioned, almost immediately because of certain religious, pressing political theological problems that he's confronted with that make him much less, I think, sanguine personally about the possibilities of how far an aesthetic solution to the problem can succeed. But I'm just trying to make the best and most convincing case I can for what he thought might be possible. Yeah, maybe you could repeat the gist of your question, having to do with the political. Oh yeah, no, I'm sorry. Now my train of thought is finally senior moment here, guys. Sorry. Well, he really thinks that there will be an increase in pleasure if more and more people have good taste, can get real, can enjoy Mozart and Beethoven and jazz, and that, in other words, civilization actually can enhance our collective capacity for pleasure. It won't be animal pleasure. It will be this other, more elevated or disinterested pleasure, as he puts it. And so I think on the other hand, if it's not good art, then it's all glittering misery. So the difference, all that glitters is not gold, but some that glitters is gold. And so he wants to turn the glitter into gold, you could say. And he's providing a kind of aesthetic theory which overcomes some of the bottlenecks that he thinks to that, and therefore facilitates a kind of collective cultural elevation, aesthetic elevation, which doesn't lead automatically to a moralization, but that in various ways facilitates that. And then also, and not least, because the genuine pleasure we take in great art can begin to outweigh the art as a mere commodity. Art is a mere way of showing off. In other words, you're going to appreciate the painting because it gives you so much pleasure to look at, not to impress your neighbors when you hang it on the wall. And so, I mean, there's a very telling phrase that I repeat in the paper about how when civilization reaches its nearest highest point, art is valued almost infinitely more for the fact that, other people will like it too, than the actual pleasure anyone gets from it. And that's devastating. That makes taste easily seduced by, these sort of vanity, luxury, all of these sort of negative passions and inclinations that make it so dangerous. But if you can beef up, as it were, the actual pleasure principle, some of these negative consequences are less likely to occur. So I think that's part of his solution, is to increase the actual pleasure, not that an elite class takes in great art, but that everyone, is able to take in great art, that this becomes a kind of common experience to the extent possible. Which in a way is the idea of art appreciation courses, right? I mean, why we have art appreciation courses in universities, presumably, or even in high school, it's supposed to be elevate everybody's sensibility.
Joining us from the true north, strong and free, Mr. Bitar.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. That was wonderful. And the relation of beauty to politics was original, but in a discipline sense that Kant affirms. But I was going to ask something more in the aesthetics itself, really stemming from Elizabeth's question about the fountain in a way. And that is, how or in what sense is the art of genius beautiful? Right? Kant says that it's beautiful, unless Geyer's translation is wildly off. He says it not only that it's fine art, but that it's beautiful and it has beauty. So we understand that it's not pure free beauty, and it's not adherent, dependent beauty linked to a concept of perfection. But then, if we say that it's distinguished by the aesthetic idea and by setting in motion of reason, I mean, the fountain may be an extreme example, but the setting in motion of reason, is it set in motion by the beautiful, or is the criteria of beauty that it sets in motion? Because, for example, it would seem that for it to be beautiful, you'd have to be, this setting in motion of reason would have to be, I thought it would be quite internal to what he calls the free play of imagination and understanding, that somehow you're in the beautiful and your understanding is moved, inspired, driven to further thought. And that further thought, it almost seems to take one beyond the aesthetic. I don't know. So is it, what is, where is the beauty in this? Or is it more, is the Jupiter example maybe more, is it, because in that example, it's plausible that you have something that's what we understand as beautiful that also moves your mind to aesthetic ideas.
No, that's, go ahead, I don't.
No, please.
No, that's great. I mean, again, these are really complicated questions. I mean, matters, and there's great dispute in the literature, and I'm just sort of, I'm spouting off here, but there would have to be 40 footnotes for everything I say. And this is by no means a conventional reading of the Critique of Judgment. Let me assure you. I'm not sure I know of anyone who would in the Kant world who would agree with at least what I'm saying in toto. But I think what he does allow for what he calls the beautiful presentation of the sublime. And therefore, I mean, beauty and sublimity, although in one sense they're conceptually opposite, in another sense, in fine art, I think they come together again, at least they can come together again. But what makes the feeling that is aroused by fine art, a feeling of beauty, is ultimately, I think, the feeling of unity that, in other words, in a certain sense, it is very formal. It's the animation of productive imagination, understanding, and reason in a way that is somehow mutually harmonious. And it may involve, tension. It may involve, especially in the case of, beautiful presentations of the sublime, there may be a kind of jarring effect. Maybe I don't know if you find the urinal sublime, but one could perhaps substitute other modern works of art. But in general, there is a feeling, unlike the sublime in nature, where you feel this kind of pain and then you sort of a kind of moral elevation. In the case of the beautiful presentation of the sublime, which is a purely aesthetic experience, it's not that you're thinking things, but that somehow reason is stimulated to move in some way that is somehow in harmony with these other faculties. I mean, it would be very complicated to provide a more adequate answer to your very good question. But I think that's where the beauty, that's the affinity between natural and artistic beauty, is that this feeling of life is a kind of mutually supportive animation of these various faculties, and the difference between art that arouses, or beauty that arouses aesthetic ideas, it just has this additional dimension that simple natural beauty lacks, which is the bringing in of reason.
Okay, good. But it would still then have the harmony.
Yeah, there's a harmony.
So it's not
Yeah.
merely formal, but it still would have something of some.
What's formal is the harmony, is the fact that
Yes,
everybody's sort of agreeing with everything,
With the
despite
further
what whatever the content is, whether it's a
Yes.
urinal or a sunset or whatever it is, it's in the expression of that, in that representation, what is aroused, what is brought about in the mind of the judge, who has acquired this, the proper taste, is this feeling of inner life, which is a kind of unity of all of one's cognitive faculties kind of in motion together, and not depleting one, but somehow reinforcing each other. That's another important part of this.
Okay, thank
Um, the denouement of our conversation today, I think, will involve a number of representatives from the University of Chicago once upon a time. So if anyone would like to add a cacophonous bass note to that, jump on the queue. So moving from Brian Bitar on to Michael Gillespie. Dr. Gillespie, please go ahead.
Susan, I this builds on what Tim mentioned. It seems to me, if you think about Hegel seems to think that with the completion of knowledge and absolute knowledge, there's no room for art. And if you leap forward to Tolstoy makes a strong argument that Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is not art because it doesn't have a moral purpose. And Nietzsche
Doesn't?
Well,
That's news to me.
I'm just saying what he says. And Nietzsche talks about the Gegensätzliche Ureine, the contradictory primordial one, which doesn't really provoke a notion of harmony. So I'm wondering whether or not maybe Rousseau wasn't more on the track of where things were going than Kant was, because Kant seems to harken back to some notion of a classical, a combination of classicism and the primitive, or the genius, but the genius has to have a kind of academic education, which certainly was what was consistently rejected, I think, by lots of later artists.
Well, but I mean, I'm stretching what Kant means by an academic. I'm suggesting that no, that's not really true. I mean, artists still go to art school.
No, but the rejection of the academy by people like Debussy, a lot of.
Yeah, but that's not what he means necessarily by, I guess I don't think that his whatever he may have personally thought, given the limitations of what he was exposed to, I don't think the theory is restricted to that very kind of conventional understanding and historically limited understanding of what the school of taste would consist in. I mean, I think he, given his enthusiasm for Milton and partial appreciation of what was going on in the German Sturm und Drang. I mean, he's open to that art. I mean, I think what's really exciting in the Critique of Judgment is his openness, just barely, to the new aesthetic possibilities that are brought about by the French Revolution. And I think there's a kind of intimation that we'd have to look at other passages from the Critique of Judgment that the classics may not be necessary, or that there could be a better, a new and improved classic, which did not suffer the limitations of classical art because it incorporated a kind of self-conscious understanding of the intimate connection between reason and freedom. But that's a whole other, that would be a whole other story. No, absolutely. I mean, Kant and Hegel and Nietzsche, of course, are critics of Kant. And I don't presume to be. It would be wonderful if to know, to put Hegel and Kant next to each other and really examine them. But I do think that Rousseau is not, in this respect, is really pointing toward Kant more than, and maybe Hegel in a way, but not Nietzsche, because for at least as I read Rousseau, especially in a work like Emile, the form, or in other works where he talks about forms, it's, there's an appeal to a kind of unity, a feeling, a sentiment of one's own existence, which is threatened by amour propre, which and other other distortions that take us out of ourselves, but that fundamentally revolve around this idea of being a whole and feeling one's own wholeness, and that's in a way what beauty accomplishes for Kant. It allows us to feel ourselves as a whole, which is something we can't do through thought. Kant has no idea of the human being. We're these different faculties, and we can sort of figure out how they work together, but we're rational, but we're animal, and we can't quite put them together conceptually in a satisfying union. But at the level of aesthetics, we can feel that union. We can feel ourselves as wholes. And I think there is a certain similarity between that idea and what Rousseau might have, or what Kant might have gotten from Rousseau.
Mr. Benegar.
Hi, Susan. I would love to hear more about your thoughts about the relationship between the realm of aesthetics and the realm of politics, and just to stimulate the subject. It seems to me that one could make a case for aesthetics belonging to a lower realm than the realm of morals and politics. The way Carl Schmitt argued that no one kills for the sake of artistic style. It's on the other hand, one can think of aesthetics as being super political and super moral. I assume that's inconsistent with Kant's understanding that there couldn't be a realm higher than the moral. So you have these two realms. It seems like the thrust of your talks were trying to identify aesthetics with politics. So I wanted to see whether you had more thoughts to say about that.
Well, no, I mean that's a great question, Nasser. No, I didn't mean to say that. I think the relationship is quite complicated, and maybe the place to look for Kant's final and considered view would be in the part 2 of the conflict of the faculties. There's a very famous passage where he describes the experience of spectators of the French Revolution in its early phase before they killed the king and all of that, and as a kind of moment, it's a kind of aesthetic moment which registers what has to ultimately happen for Kant, if politics is going to get beyond a kind of mechanical arrangement for nations of devils, if it's going to move beyond Hobbes, there has to be a kind of inner transformation which isn't quite yet moral, but does involve, and for me, some of Abraham Lincoln's rhetoric is a sort of beautiful illustration of this, whatever Abraham Lincoln may have himself had in mind, that rights become something we're willing to die for. The rights of others become something we're willing to die for. And because we care about our own rights. We obey the law because it's the law. We obey the Constitution because we revere the Constitution, which isn't quite for moral reasons. It has this sort of intermediate quality for Kant. And I don't want to say that it's aesthetic. I think for him, in that sense, the aesthetic is sub-political. And this is where I think Hannah Arendt goes wrong, because she conflates them in her study of Kant. She wants the aesthetic common sense, shared sense, and to be the basis of politics, or to be the same. And I think that's a misreading of Kant, and I don't think it's a dangerous misreading, because for Kant, there's no getting around ultimately that politics is coercive and aesthetics isn't. And so in one sense, it's lower because, you really can't get anything done finally if you're not willing to back it up with an army. But on the other hand, what you achieve on the basis of a kind of political foundation, if it's going to go beyond mere calculated self-interest, has to find some intermediary platform between self-interest rightly understood on the one hand, and this kind of kingdom of ends, kind of ethical commonwealth, kingdom of God on earth, whatever other terms you want. And that's where I think the aesthetic comes into play for him, that can provide some kind of intermediary. So in one sense, it's lower, and he would never say you can conflate them. You need the army. You need laws, and they need to be enforced. But on the other hand, aesthetics enables people to live together in some free commonality, which is lawful without being coercive. And that's the I think the beauty, it's so-called the beauty of beauty, you could say, for Kant.
Alex Oren.
So if that's true, does Kant believe that the government should try to push some kind of aesthetic education, or should it simply let the aesthetic realm unfold on its own?
Well, I mean, that's a terrific question. I mean, obviously this runs up against, is art becoming a substitute for religion? And where does civic religion fit into this? And I think that is precisely why, to the extent that Kant, in a way, in the Critique of Judgment, expects art in a way that art will do the job of civic religion, that he has to abandon that belief very, very shortly thereafter. And therefore a different kind of work is required that has some affinities with what he does in the Critique of Judgment, but in a way, starts in a different place. But I think, for the later 19th century, to the extent that it's in some, it's a very derivative, maybe shallow sense, flows from Kant, downstream from Kant. There is this idea that, art can replace religion. And I don't think Kant would go quite that far, but there's a glimmer of that in the Critique of Judgment.
We've arrived at the end of our queue. I don't want to rush us off, although we are getting close to the end of our planned time. I had a question, if no one else does. Susan, I was very struck by your remarks about what you called just now a productive class conflict over taste. And in the written document, you seem to allude to a kind of breakdown along class lines, referencing contemporary disputes about politics. Could you expand on what is the suggestion that a polity can be composed of kind of an argument about taste that leads for fine art to be broadened out in its appreciation by the lower classes, and the lower classes to infuse what counts as fine art with a kind of earthy, rustic novelty that keeps fine art, or the higher classes' taste for art, from becoming fusty and old-fashioned? Is that is it a peaceful version of that? What you're trying to imply is
Well,
this?
I'm just trying to understand what has gone wrong, what has gone so seriously wrong in the last 30, 40 years, maybe since the war in Vietnam, I'm not sure. It seems to me that the dispute it's obviously a moral dispute, but it also is, and a political dispute, but it's also an aesthetic dispute. But aesthetic in a kind of, the sense of style. What do you drink, Starbucks or Dunkin's? I mean, do you like country music or progressive rock? I mean, it's very strange the way in which the current polarization has a kind of aesthetic dimension. And the question is, might aesthetics once again, in the way that during the civil rights era, I think the appropriation of Black music, of rural Black music, first through jazz, right, which was very much a refinement, an intellectual refinement, but it grew out of Delta blues and so on. And then, the weaving together of folk music. I mean, maybe I'm just reflecting my own 60s childhood, but, the sort of appropriation, but respectful appropriation of bluegrass, of mountain people's music, Appalachian music, as a kind of common, aesthetic language that enabled people to sort of overcome some of their differences. Was a kind of good example of this all working. It's subsequently somewhat come a cropper, but I'm more puzzled than I don't have any particular answers. But it does seem as if the vaguely Kantian project, which was going strong in the 19th century and even in a way had a final flowering in the 50s and 60s, has for one reason or another come a cropper. And popular, on the one hand, popular entertainment seems to be so commercialized that it can't perform a number of the tasks that it used to perform. And on the other hand, there's this kind of common, shared resentment against the elites, although they're different elites usually, that signals a sense of just a profound lack of mutual respect among Americans of different kinds. And it seems to me that it's best the kind of reciprocal communication Kant was talking about was predicated on mutual respect between classes who otherwise could be very much at each other's throats. And so that, again, as I say, before there was Marxist class conflict, of an angry sort, there was Kantian class conflict of a friendly and productive sort. And it's more an open-ended question of whether anything along those lines might be brought back.
If a class conflict over taste could bring a people together in this Kantian sense, could it exaggerate a difference that isn't otherwise tangible as things degenerate and deteriorate, in the way that you said that there's a pessimistic streak to Kant that is sometimes under?
No, that's a really good point. That maybe maybe this is the tail end of what. But insofar as I think the premise of what Kant is describing is mutual respect of a simple sort. I don't mean some highfalutin moral respect. I just mean that one approaches the art of the people not to make fun of it, but because you really think there might be something there that's worth discovering, and that at the same time, people who are not particularly well educated, but maybe producing beautiful art, would feel confident in stepping forward and sharing it, making it available, and perhaps going to college and learning more so that they could do a better job of making it shareable.
Well, with that remarkable suggestion, maybe we should bring things to a close.
Talk about naive, huh?
I could never say that. thank you everyone for your participation. Thank you, Susan, for your paper and for your generous answers to so many very difficult and fascinating questions today. I'm sure everyone knows how to reach you if they have further inquiries or would like to hear more about your book, which I can't wait to see.
Yeah, no, I would appreciate it. And send me an email if you have other questions, or you want to continue, or you want to have at me in ways you didn't have time to have at me this afternoon. I'm sure I deserve it. And again, I'm just, I'm sort of thinking out loud here when I spin out this possibility. I really don't want to blame Kant for it or suggest that I have great hopes, which I don't. But it seems that something has gone awry that Kant might help us better understand. That's as much as I could say confidently.
Tremendous. Well, thank you, everyone, and have a good weekend.
Thank you very much. These are great questions. I really appreciate it.